Hello, and first of all, I'd like to start off by wishing everyone watching a very happy World Carnivorous Plants Day 2023. As I'm sure you know already, or will be thrilled to find out, the International Carnivorous Plant Society produces a series of informative and interesting videos on the topic of carnivorous plants, obviously, every year for World Carnivorous Plants Day. As I am sure you can probably tell, the subject of this video is going to be the genus Genlisea, otherwise known as corkscrew plants, which I have subtitled The Forgotten Carnivore because they are very often disregarded or overlooked by even among carnivorous plant enthusiasts. So, by way of short introduction, my name's Fraser Anderson. As I'm sure you can tell from the accent, I'm based in Scotland, and I've been growing carnivorous plants for a number of years, and particularly have been interested for a number of years and focused on Genlisea and their two sister groups of plants, which are Utricularia, the bladderworts, and Pinguicula, the butterworts. And together these three groups form the family Lentibulariaceae. So I'll just spell out a brief structure of the presentation before we can get stuck into it. So I'll start off by addressing what are Genlisea, a brief introduction to general aspects of the plants before going on to deal with the history of them, when they were discovered and described to science, and other associated pieces of information about the development of our understanding of these plants, before going on to look at the different parts of a Genlisea, with particular focus on the fascinating trap mechanisms. As you can see, this is a close-up image of a Genlisea trap here, or the tip of a Genlisea trap here, and you can see the spiral pattern that gives them the common name corkscrew plants, which is one of their interesting features, along with the beautiful flowers, as you can see on the left here. I would note that all of the photos featured throughout this presentation are my own work, with the exception of images where photo credits appear, and all photos that were not taken by me are fully credited. If you do have any questions relating to the contents or the terminology used throughout the presentation, I have tried to kind of gear it towards a wide range of audiences, from those who are very much beginners in the carnivorous plant world and eager to learn more, to those who are more experienced. But if you do have questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to address them either directly, or if you're watching it on a platform like YouTube, you can leave a comment in the comments below, and I'll make an effort to check them and see if I can address any queries. So let's get into it then. So what are Genlisea then? That's a good question to start out with, considering this will be the topic of the discussion. So we can see here a number of colourful flowers, and these are members of the family that I mentioned, Lentibulariaceae. Now, Genlisea is one of the three members of this family, and these images in the middle are all Genlisea. Their sister species sister genera that many people will be acquainted with are the butterworts, the Pinguicula. We have here some representatives of Mexican and other Latin American Pinguicula. They're famous for their very kind of flypaper sticky leaves and their beautiful flowers, obviously, which is a common feature among Lentibulariaceae. The flowers are all stunning. In fact, I would say they're mainly grown for their flowers in cultivation and carnivorous plant circles. This on the right here is Utricularia. You can see the famous bladder trap here. They form little bubbles and they suck in prey with a trigger activated trap door that operates faster than a human eye can blink. And again, they've got these very distinctive flowers. Now in the middle we have Genlisea. As you can see, they're relatively similar to Utricularia in that they, particularly terrestrial or ground-growing Utricularia, in that they form small rosettes of leaves on the surface, although a lot of the intriguing trap activity, as you can see in this image on my hand, goes on under the surface, but their unassuming appearance makes them perhaps easily confused with Utricularia. But the surefire way to tell the difference is if you look at this image down here of Genlisea africana, you can see the calyx, which is the clasp that holds the flower in place, has 5 parts in it, like a star. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whereas in Utricularia that would only have 2 lobes, one at the top and one at the bottom. So yes, they're small herbaceous plants. They grow in waterlogged soil. They form a little rosette of leaves and have some pretty stunning flowers, if I would say so myself. We see here with this hybrid, actually this is a hybrid of Genlisea flexuosa and lobata. So where do they fit in with other carnivorous plants? Well, we can see here a family tree of all of the carnivorous plants. Well, actually not quite all of the carnivorous plants. I mean, I said Genlisea was the forgotten carnivore, but there are some that are even more forgotten, as they have even been forgotten off this graphic. However, we can see here, so you have your kind of more, I would say, common or popular, particularly in cultivation, genuses such as Nepenthes, your tropical pitcher plants, or Sarracenia, which is your trumpet pitcher plants, Drosera, your sundews, and of course the iconic Venus flytrap. So they're all up here in this group, which contains all of these in a single clade or a single branch of this tree. So we can see here that the carnivorous lifestyle developed among these plants in common here. Now, up in the monocot family, which is it's a distinction based on how the seeds develop, we have the carnivorous bromeliads, which are native to South America and parts of North America as well. And then following down we have, as I mentioned, Sarracenia and Helianthus, things like that, that are more common. But, so as we can see from here, carnivorous plants have developed a number of different times throughout different groups independently of each other. But down here we have what's an order known as Lamiales, which also contains common household plants such as mint, for example. But we can see within Lamiales there's no kind of neat branch that contains all of them, like there is in this group here that contains sundews and Venus flytraps and things like that. We can see that actually carnivorous habits have developed independently 3 times just within the Lamiales. And the one that's been left off here that's a true carnivore is Philcoxia, which is a very small and rare carnivorous plant with sticky leaves that grows in sand dunes in Brazil. But as you can see here, Lentibulariaceae. So initially you had Pinguiculas, as I mentioned, these butterworts with the sticky leaves. They were the kind of basal, so that's what their ancestor looked like. And then they developed into a sister group which contains the closely related Genlisea and Utricularia. So they're not particularly, they are somewhat closely related to Biblis, which are a kind of small, sticky carnivorous plant from northern and western Australia. But they're not particularly closely related to any other carnivorous plants. So they are kind of out on their own, so a little bit of an oddity, and definitely worth appreciation in their own right. So how do we know about Genlisea then? Well, it all goes back to this gentleman here on the left, who was a French botanist who operated in the mid to late 1800s, and his name was Auguste de Saint-Hilaire, or Auguste de Saint-Hilaire in an English language pronunciation. And he conducted a number of expeditions in South America and Brazil in particular. And it was his second expedition in Brazil on which he discovered the genus Genlisea. And he collected a number of specimens and described them based on these. So among these 5 species was Genlisea aurea, which is this strapping golden flower that you can see, and of course aurea means golden in Latin, which makes a lot of sense. But yes, an excerpt of his book Voyage dans le district des Diamants et sur le littoral du Brésil, which is the book in which he described his journeys on his second voyage and includes the description of the genus and the first 5 species, is pictured over here. Not the full description, obviously, but just a little excerpt. But you can see Genlisea aurea here. It's a very striking flower, and it has among the largest flowers in the genus, and it has this really odd-looking, fascinating gelatinous foliage where each leaf is surrounded by a bubble of mucilage, or slime as it is colloquially known. So the name Genlisea comes from a popular author in Europe at the time who was named Stéphanie Comtesse de Genlis. And in fact there were a number of different plants named after her, so her writing must have been relatively good. Not that I've read it myself. So throughout the later 1800s and into the 1900s, you had a series of botanical expeditions that expanded our understanding of the diversity of Genlisea and where they occurred, which included British botanist Daniel Oliver describing species of the genus that were found in tropical Africa by Austrian botanist Friedrich Welwitsch. Yes, this continued with a variety of authors and people who were working on the genus and travelling in the quote-unquote New World, where new species were discovered among the genus. The genus was first actually brought into cultivation out of its natural habitat with Genlisea violacea, which is a species native to the southern highlands of Brazil, and that was brought to cultivation in Germany at the end of the 1800s. And here is a closer look at this really kind of odd but strangely satisfying, I would say, gelatinous foliage that you get on Genlisea aurea. So you can actually see the outline of the individual leaves surrounded by their bubble of jelly, which has been described variously as looking like a bogey sitting on top of the soil surface, which, you can't dispute. Now, Genlisea aurea and the genus Genlisea in general, but represented by Genlisea aurea, has made history once again by turning out to actually have among the smallest genome of any flowering plant. And it's a kind of variable genome size, because Genlisea aurea has a genome size of 61 megabase pairs. Now, the megabase pairs means that it's the number of different rungs in the DNA helix ladder that is inside every cell. So it's got very few rungs, so all of the instructions for coding for how to make a Genlisea aurea are contained in a very short number of steps, whereas, for example, another species within the genus, Genlisea hispidula, has among the largest genome among the whole family Lentibulariaceae, at 1,510 megabase pairs, which is a huge difference between 61 and 1,510. And in fact, this tiny genome that you find in Genlisea aurea is so small that it's believed to be approaching the kind of lower limit for the actual minimum number of genes that you can have and still have a functioning plant. The genome is so small that the actual chromosomes in this plant are the same size as those that you find in bacteria, which is fascinating. So it makes it really appealing for genetic research and as a model organism, so an organism that they look at in scientific research on plants to figure out things about how genes work, which has really practical applications for industries that rely on plants, such as agriculture, which I'm sure you would agree is a relatively important industry in terms of global impact. So how is this tiny genome been achieved? Well, Genlisea contains a number of mutations, as does Utricularia, its sister genus, including a particular mutation in an enzyme that deals with phosphate, which has the unfortunate result of producing a lot of very reactive oxygen containing elements, which are very destructive for DNA. So the result of that is that their DNA is constantly being bombarded by these molecules, and so it's gradually got smaller over time as they've lost any kind of redundant genes that are in there and reduced the non-coding regions in between their different genes. And this constant bombardment by reactive molecules, which causes damage to their DNA, which has to constantly be repaired, means that Genlisea have a particularly high rate of mutation and change, which means they evolve really quickly compared to other plants. Which makes sense because they are, evolutionarily speaking, one of the new kids on the block. They're among the most recent of all flowering plants, actually. So if you cast your mind back to the first slide, then we're now looking at the how the Genlisea trap developed. You'll remember that it has these kind of spiraling tubular traps, and a diagram of that can be seen on the left here, the so-called eel traps. Now, how did this, as I mentioned, Pinguicula is the kind of ancestor, or a plant that looked like Pinguicula, not Pinguicula itself, was the ancestor of Utricularia and Genlisea. So how did you get from a flat, sticky leaf to this very intricate underground curved trap structure? Now this diagram, very well set out, taken from the Genlisea monograph, which is a fantastic text, spells out a possible hypothesis, which to me seems very plausible, where you have this very kind of flat glandular leaf that you find on Pinguicula. This here plant on the right is a Pinguicula lusitanica, which is a small butterwort native to Western Europe. So you take a leaf that has these kind of glands on it, and you get a situation where the leaf margins, the edges of the leaf, get some degree of motion. They can roll up, which is a useful feature if you have flat leaves to prevent your prey that you've caught from being washed off, which would be of no benefit to you whatsoever. And we can see that here, particularly on this leaf on the right here, where you can see the leaf margins have curled up. Now, if this continues, obviously you get to this situation where, as in Pinguicula lusitanica, you very often get leaves that are so curled that the margins touch. Now, it doesn't take a huge amount of adaptation for these margins to start fusing with each other, and in fact this is the exact process in a different group of plants that led to the creation of pitcher plants, specifically Sarracenia, not your tropical pitcher plants, but Sarracenia, where, although I think actually the tropical pitcher plants did do this, but I'm not informed on that, so I won't make any kind of definite statement. But these fused leaf margins, then you end up with a kind of tube of leaf with glands on the inside, which forms, and if the tip is fused as well, you get what's called an epiacidiate leaf, which is basically a kind of a pouch full of glands. Now, it doesn't take the next step for that would be potentially this. I don't think this has been fully demonstrated. Would be to form a tube, and then obviously the tube specializes further and then starts twisting. Now, the reason that the trap twists is so that the entrances to the traps, which we'll discuss later, can be exposed in all directions. But as you can see, the journey from flat leaf to twisting tubular trap is perhaps initially, the jump from this to this is not so obvious, but when you look at it step by step and you see examples like Pinguicula lusitanica, you can start to see why that makes sense. So, what are the different parts of a Genlisea? Well, I think obviously being a plant, you can tell that it has the typical parts of a plant, namely leaves. We're going to start focusing on the leaves. So Genlisea forms a small rosette of leaves. They're small herbaceous leaves that sit on the soil surface. There is quite some variation though. As you can see, this is Genlisea oxycentron, which is one of the smallest species, certainly one of the smallest species in cultivation, but one of the smallest species known. It forms these really small rosettes. You can see against grains of sand here, it's even small, with these kind of spoon-shaped leaves. Now, although it's small, it's fairly typical in terms of the fact that it forms quite concrete round rosettes with spoon-shaped leaves, which is the kind of norm for the genus and is repeated in pretty much every other species in the genus. There is obviously some variation on this. Down here we have Genlisea roraimensis, which is native to the high tabletop mountains of northern South America, the tepuis, which are well known for their other carnivorous plants, their Helianthera and their carnivorous bromeliads brocchinia. Now, roraimensis has these really distinctive, quite succulent, really thick leaves with a kind of spoon-shaped indentation. And this blue circle here links back to what we were discussing on the previous slide, where it's produced a trap a leaf that has a kind of tubular shape to it accidentally. So that's a little hiccup there in how it's formed that leaf, but it does lend plausibility to the fact that the tube hypothesis might be correct. This is Genlisea africana over here on the left, which is notable because although it does form a fairly standard rosette, it's notable for its very dark pigmented leaves, which are really interesting actually, a nice purple bronzy colour. And as you can see from many of these photos, the flowers actually arise from the centre of the rosette, where the same place where the leaves arise from. So that's where the flower stalks come out, and they produce these kind of tall flower stalks with the flowers on the end, a couple of clusters, a couple of flowers clustered one after the other. This is an interesting one here though, because normally Genlisea have these kind of flat, bald or glabrous leaves would be the technical term, but this particular form of Genlisea hispidula, which was collected in Angola, has a covering or an indumentum of small hairs all over the leaf, which is quite interesting. Although observations by growers has noted that due to according to or depending on environmental conditions, it can also produce those glabrous bald leaves. But it is very notable for that. I haven't seen that in any other example of the species other than this one particular strain. Now, this is a little species called Genlisea exhibitionista, which is demonstrating the ability of this genus to deviate from the kind of central rosettes. This one has obviously spread quite prolifically throughout the pot, and now it does this by sending out its traps, which, as we'll discuss, the traps are technically leaves, not roots, and then forming new photosynthetic leaves off that. Although there is a species, Genlisea repens. Repens means creeping in Latin, which makes sense because it has this kind of central little point where all the rhizomes arise from, where all the leaves arise from, which is known as a rhizome. And those are stretched out to become linear, and so it kind of crawls around like that rather than forming a little rosette. Now, obviously, beyond the leaves, we have the flowers, which are, in my opinion, it's the main interest of Genlisea for growing them. It's an absolute joy to see the flowers on these plants because they're so diverse and so striking. The ones with scale bars here are, I probably should have picked other ones to be honest, because they are unusually small for the genus with these kind of 1 millimeter sizes. They're not very big at all. Whereas things like the ones below them, Africana and Hispidula, they have leaves that can easily get to 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeters across, and are quite impressive actually, I have to say, in terms of the colour and the pattern of them. Now, as mentioned, the basic plan for a Genlisea flower is that you have the pedicel or the stem, which comes off of a main stalk, and then the calyx, like I mentioned, is the clasp that holds the flower and the structures of the flower. You have 2 lobes to this flower, so the petals are all fused. The fused petals are known as a corolla. Now you have two lobes in all of them. You can see here an upper lobe, which normally curves over. Here you can see is quite reduced. In this one as well, this is Oxycentron. Africana, you can see it's paler. Hispidula, this one is Glandulosissima. Aurea and Violacea. So they have this upper lobe, which is composed of 1 to 2 different lobes. So it's got the kind of the different lobes. So this is the upper corolla. The lower corolla is fused to form a tube which contains the nectar, which is known as the spur. As we can see here, this is the spur of this one. The spur is poking out here, and this is the spur on this one. And now in Glandulosissima, the spur is quite reduced and forms a sort of bucket shape, which is interesting. And in Africana, the spur is short enough that it's hidden behind the front of this lower corolla. Now, the bit where the lower corolla forms a sort of lip or snapdragon type shape with the upper lip is known as the palate. And the lower corolla obviously has this three-lobed structure. Now, as we can see here in this Genlisea aurea, when you open up the kind of snapdragon type thing, you can see the entrance to where the nectar spur would be, which is where pollinators would go to reach their reward, and in doing so they would come across the reproductive anatomy of the Genlisea, which is the same body plan as all other members of Lentibulariaceae. So your bladderworts and your butterworts, your utriculares and pinguiculas, they'll have the same structures for pollen production, etc. So we have here the two different kind of curved stamens, and they are supporting the anthers, which produce the pollen. So these things are where the pollen is produced, and now this little kind of line that's on top is actually a flap, which is the stigma, which is the receptive part. So in order to avoid self-pollinating itself, only the outer surface of the stigma is receptive to pollen, and the inner surface actually covers its own anthers to avoid pollinating itself. However, a lot of Genlisea can actually produce seeds on their own. It's just that it's evolutionarily beneficial to not pursue inbreeding in order to avoid genetic defects which can crop up as a result of that in plants and in other organisms that reproduce with gametes or sexual cells. Now, in this example here, Utricularia glandulosissima, we can see that the flower has obviously not fully opened. Now, this is a persistent problem that I have encountered, well, not necessarily a problem, but a persistent situation that I've encountered in cultivation, where the flowers won't open fully, but they do still produce seed and reproduce perfectly fine. Now, this particular trait is known as cleistogamy, which means that the flowers don't open, but they do pollinate themselves. As opposed to chasmogamy, which is where the flowers open normally, so to speak. And this is a kind of collation of different Genlisea, of course, flowers from my own personal collection in cultivation, and they're all adjusted to be in proportion to one another. We can see up here in the top left the scale bar of 1 millimeter, and from that all of the rest of the flowers are in proportion. So you can see there's quite a variation in terms of the different sizes of these flowers, with this Genlisea glandulosissima being quite small, and this Oxycentron, as I mentioned, being the smallest in my experience anyway. This is Genlisea nebulicola, which is also quite small. This is Hispidula from that really odd hairy-leafed population. This is Genlisea africana, Genlisea roraimensis, the one with the succulent spoon-shaped leaves with a little indent. This is another Hispidula population, as is this one. This is the only Genlisea cultivar currently in existence, Genlisea hispidula Odin, which I registered, I think, a year and a half ago, possibly more. And then this one here and this one is Nigrocollis. This is a Pygmaea, and this one is a Genlisea pulchella, which is slightly unusually formed as it has 4 lobes on the lower corolla rather than 3. Now, assuming the plant is pollinated, now in the wild as well, not much is really known about how the plants are pollinated, but assuming the plants are pollinated, they will begin to form seeds, obviously fruit and then seeds, and we can see here the fruit of a Genlisea repens. Now, this little kind of nubbin on top is the remains of the stigma, which is that flap that covers the anthers that I discussed previously. Now, the pollen will travel down into the ovary and fertilise the seeds, or the ovules, which then become the seeds, and then the fruit ripens, still attached to this calyx or this clasper here. Now, Genlisea is divided into a number of different groups, which we'll discuss shortly. But basically the way to divide the groups based on anatomy is when the seeds are ripe, you can see this seed pod has got a variety of kind of encircling rings that go around it, or fault lines almost, and you can see one that goes right across the middle there. Now when that's ripe, the outer wall of this seed pod will dry out and then crack along these lines, forming a series of rings which then drop away. Often leaving a cup in the lower half, which disperses the seeds when raindrops hit it. The other group has a very similar situation, except the split in the seed pod is one continuous split that goes from pole to pole. So it's not kind of latitude rings. It's a longitudinal split in two, like a clamshell. Now, this is an illustration by Francis Lloyd in his very influential book, The Carnivorous Plants. As you can see, we are moving on to the main event when it comes to Genlisea anatomy, which is the traps. Now, diagram 10 you can see is the basic outline of a trap. On the title slide, it was just one arm that was photographed up close, but you can see they form these Y-shaped traps with 2 arms, a neck, and a stomach, which you can see in greater detail. So feel free to pause and have a look at these illustrations before we move on to discuss the Genlisea trap anatomy. Now, Genlisea traps are known as rhizophils, technically, which comes from the Greek roots, which mean root leaf. And that is because Genlisea traps, although they look fairly root-like, being kind of pale and underground, are actually highly modified leaves, as we discussed with the step-by-step process whereby the flat glandular leaf of Pinguicula could potentially turn into a tube-shaped trap like this. And we can see here that they have this kind of spiral pattern which lends itself to the name corkscrew plant. So these different arms, they always twist in the same direction in every Genlisea, and each arm of the trap twists opposite to each other. Now, the reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, is so that the trap mouths are exposed in all different directions to maximise prey capture. And you can't really see it on these photos, but there are slits or holes or openings at the inside, at the base of this frill that goes all the way down the trap, different kind of holes, etc. You can see them on the diagram by Francis Lloyd. Now, there's 2 different kind of body plans for Genlisea rhizophils, which I don't have a good photo of it here, but you can see it on this hybrid Genlisea flexuosa crossed with lobata. You can see that all of the kind of rhizophils or traps look fairly uniform in terms of thickness and in terms of the direction in which they're growing. Now, on the other groups of Genlisea, which we'll discuss how Genlisea is divided up into different groups, but on most of the other groups of Genlisea, you have what's called dimorphic traps, which is where they have 2 different forms. So you have these kind of thick-ish ones that spread mostly shortly below the surface of the substrate, or along the surface of the substrate if it's growing in shallow places. And then you have much thinner, more wiry ones that descend almost straight down and are much longer. And now these are common across Genlisea, but yes, the dimorphic body plan. Now you can see here on the left, this is Genlisea uncinata, which is a kind of basal plant within its group, meaning that it's one of the less specialised, or not specialised, but less derived ones. Now this obviously round green thing here is a leaf, which is unusually underneath the rhizophyll, which I guess is also technically a leaf, but for the purposes of ease of discussion, I'll call the leaves leaves, and I'll call the rhizophylls traps or rhizophylls. But you can see here, this is a good illustration of the vesicle, or the chamber that does the digesting. Now, this chamber is hollow, and so is the trap neck and the trap arms. They're all hollow to facilitate prey to move up into the vessel here, this kind of swollen sac, and then above that is solid, and the plant simply assimilates the nutrients up from that. Now, here we have some absolutely fantastic electron microscope pictures of Genlisea traps, where you can really see those kind of entranceways, the holes or slits along the inside of the frill that I was referring to earlier that you couldn't quite make out on the photograph. But yes, really nice photography here, so feel free to pause and take in the details there. Now, this is a section, so the trap's been cut in half. So this is what the inside of the trap looks like, and this is how they capture their prey. So the inside of the trap consists of a variety of concentric rings that are made up of backwards pointing hairs. So when a small animal such as a nematode or a protozoa, which is the main prey of Genlisea, enters through one of the holes in the previous photos, it finds itself in this kind of hollow tube, basically, full of these hairs, and it can move through the hairs in one direction, but it's very difficult to move in the other direction. So in that way, it's guided up the trap towards the vessel where it will inevitably meet its untimely demise and be digested by the plant, which is a fairly gruesome way to go. Now, it's suggested that the majority of animals that enter the trap die of suffocation. Now, you can see here these kind of wheat grain looking structures here. These are called the bifid glands, which are in Utricularia, the sister genus. These bifid glands are used to remove water from the bladders or the traps in that genus in order to generate negative pressure so that prey can be actively sucked up into the trap when the door opens. In Genlisea, however, they perform a different role. They produce a kind of mucilage or slime, which is rich in polysaccharides, which are a kind of complex sugar chain and proteins. Now, it's suggested that these could either be bait to entice creatures into the trap, which I find quite plausible, or possibly lubricant to guide an easier passage up the trap for small animals that find their way in there. Now, the other kind of cell that you find, so once you progress up through all the backwards pointing hairs and find yourself in the digestion chamber, the other type of cells are these quadrifid glands, which are similar to the bifid, but they have 4 parts, which is where the name quadrifid comes from. Now, these have a different role. They also secrete things, but they don't secrete the polysaccharides and proteins like the others do. These ones secrete digestive enzymes, and they secrete them constantly into this trap, so you always have a kind of pool of digestive juices to break down and assimilate the nutrients of the animals, and they're clustered along the vessel elements of the leaf, so they're clustered right along the kind of circulatory system of the plant, which makes it very easy for the nutrients to be taken up, absorbed, and taken up into the plant for use. Now, this is a diagram of what is known as a Tesla valve, and it is fascinating because Genlisea, until recently, have thought to be a passive trap. You know, animals make their way into the trap, they make their way up, and there's no kind of additional process that helps that other than the backwards pointing hairs, but they're just barriers to exiting. But recent thought and recent investigation has sort of raised the possibility. It's completely unresolved. There's no consensus on whether or not this is the case, that Genlisea might actually be an active form of trap. In any case, they certainly have mechanisms to do that. So the way a Tesla valve works is if you look at this lower portion, you can see that fluids, or in this case a small animal, can travel really easily through the main channel here. But if you try and reverse the flow, you basically get this situation where the flow is split at each opportunity, and the flow is directed to back on itself, which creates a lot of resistance. And in Genlisea, this is exactly what happens. So water and fluids and animals or small organisms can flow up the trap towards their untimely demise in the vesicle 10 times easier than it is to go in the opposite direction out the trap. Now, so whilst it's very easy for water and prey to flow or move up the trap and difficult to move out, the question that needs to be resolved, or that is not currently resolved but is suggested by some evidence, is whether or not Genlisea generates a flow of water in itself. So, as mentioned, Utricularia can generate flow or generate negative pressure by removing water from the cell using their bifid glands. Now, Genlisea have often been found with kind of grains of sand and small inorganic pieces in their vesicles. There's not really much of an explanation as to how that sand would get there unless it was pulled in by water. So it would make sense if Genlisea are removing water from the top of the trap, that it would then pull in fresh water up the trap, whilst being very difficult for water to flow back out. Although the water flowing back out with difficulty is necessary anyway to keep the digestive enzymes that are constantly secreted and the nutrients that are broken down in the trap, rather than just having them sort of leak out. So, now that we have addressed the anatomy of Genlisea, we're going to move on to more of the kind of overview of how the plants look in the wild. So here we've got a map of the range of Genlisea, so we can see that it's spread across South America, Central America, parts of North America as it extends into Mexico, in the form of Genlisea filiformis, which also is occurring in the Caribbean here, and I suspect probably historically did occur in the very far south of Florida, but I have no evidence for that. It's just a hunch, and I don't think it would probably occur there now. And in tropical Africa as well, and on the island of Madagascar, one species also occurs, which is Genlisea margaritae, which is also represented in central tropical Africa. You might be tempted to think that if you know a bit about continental drift, you might be tempted to think that this genus can be explained in its distribution by the fact that these two continents used to be joined up. You can see South America's outline fits in pretty much perfectly with Africa's coastline, because they were part of the supercontinent Gondwanaland back in the day, a couple of 100 million years ago. But Lamiales, the group that this genus of carnivorous plants belongs to, is, as I said, the new kids on the block when it comes to evolution. The group that they're part of is only around 100 million years old, which is not that long at all in terms of evolution. So they actually developed after these continents split apart, which leaves the question of why do they have this distribution across Africa and South and Central America. Now, actually 111 at least genera or groups of plants have the same distribution. Now, the reason for it is actually long-range distribution. So, transatlantic crossings, basically. So the evidence points to the fact that Genlisea originated in South America, and probably in the southern highlands of Brazil, as that's where most of the kind of diversity of the genus is located. And obviously, because it takes time to develop new species, that would suggest that they've been there the longest. Now, they were then potentially or probably carried across the Atlantic by perhaps floating mats of vegetation that broke off in a river or something like that, or by on the feet of wetland birds For example, crossing the Atlantic, if there's seeds stuck to their feet in the mud, they can be carried across. So once they got there, they diversified into several different groups in Africa. And then one of these groups, in fact, made the crossing back. So it went back home to South America in another transatlantic event, and then developed into another group here, which is why we now have two groups in South America and two groups in Africa. Now, plants such as Genlisea that occur in kind of small habitat islands, they occur in habitats such as the Tepuy Mountains of the northern areas of South America, with these big tabletop mountains that produce these sort of climate islands where essentially the top of the mountain is very cold and wet and quite harsh, and then it immediately drops down into kind of tropical savanna. Or Inselbergs, which is a kind of large protrusion of granite or other material that doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, and we see that in Madagascar as well, where you get these kind of protrusions of rocky, wet habitats that are surrounded by very different land. Now, plants that are adapted to these habitat islands are quite good at long-range dispersal compared to other plants because, as you can imagine, it takes a long time for potentially seeds to get to other suitable locations, so they need to be adapted in order to spread themselves around, which is why Genlisea are probably good candidates for long-range dispersal, because they've got that kind of adaptation to moving between different disjunct habitats anyway. Now, as I mentioned, the genus Genlisea is divided into a number of groups. So the first split is between two subgenuses or subgenera, which are subgenus Genlisea and subgenus Tayloria, which is named after Peter Taylor, who was a botanist from Kew Gardens in London, who did a lot of work on Utricularia and Genlisea. Now, the main difference, obviously, is, as I mentioned, with the capsule opening on the seed pods. All of this group here has the kind of circumscissile rings that break off along the latitude, and then this group here splits open on the longitude. Other differences include, if you look at the nectar spur, as I mentioned, in subgenus Tayloria, it resembles Pinguicula. The other group, one of the other members of Lentibulariaceae, and is held at right angles to the corolla and is perpendicular to the pedicel or the stem here. Whereas in these other groups, you can see on Glandulosissima it's short and bucket-like, but it's held vertically and perpendicular to the pedicel. Same with this Genlisea repens here. Again, and with this Genlisea subglabra, it's held vertically. Now, here we have, in this subgenus Genlisea, we have a number of different sections. So, as mentioned, you initially had a kind of ancestor here that crossed the Atlantic and then arrived in Africa. And once it was in Africa, it split off into two groups, which was Africanae here, which contains a number of species, and Recurvatae, which also contains a smaller number of species, 3 at the moment, pending discovery of new ones, which may or may not happen. Now, it's hypothesized that Recurvatae, or a plant related to Recurvatae, was the one that crossed back over the Atlantic and then differentiated into section Genlisea, which contains a number of species spread across South and Central America. So, having addressed the anatomy and distribution of Genlisea and a general overview, what do they look like in the wild? Well, we have here Genlisea hispidula from South Africa, and we can see that this is associated with kind of wet seeps and the presence of sphagnum moss, which many carnivorous plant cultivators will be familiar with. And this is a theme that kind of repeats itself throughout the groups of Genlisea that are found throughout the world, is association with wet seeps and habitats and grassland, open grassland. Now we have a Genlisea violacea from southern Brazil, and this one in particular is this individual is associated with a more dense bank of sphagnum moss, which is interesting to see. This is Genlisea africana, and again wet grassland, and here in fact it's growing almost semi-aquatically, which happens quite a lot in section africanae, with the kind of semi-aquatic habitat within grassland areas, and you can see obviously sympatric or co-occurring carnivorous plants here that many of you will recognise being Drosera. Again, more wet grassland, but here with quite a profusion of flowers among Genlisea bartholletii, which is an annual species that grows in seasonally dry habitats. And a similar situation again in Brazil with the wet grassland here, even verging onto actual submerged growing in a stream with Genlisea aurea. Here we have Genlisea margaritae from Madagascar, interestingly growing on very kind of shallow and rocky environments, as we see here with this habitat shot, but it produces this amazing rosette of leaves, and it's growing with something in the family Eriocoliceae. Now, in seasonally dry habitats, there's an interesting adaptation in one species, Genlisea tuberosa, where actually the plant dies back, as you can see here in full growth here, and then dying back in this photo. It produces a tuber in order to withstand the dry conditions underground before regrowing when the moisture returns. So that's a particularly fascinating adaptation. On the other hand, we also have other plants that grow in almost pure sand. This is a Genlisea filiformis, which is growing in pretty much pure sand on the bank of a stream here in a wet habitat, and you can see the rosette of leaves and then the flowers that have come up, and the seed pods there as well. Now, more typical of Violacea, we saw Violacea just there growing in a dense sphagnum habitat, but more typical of Violacea is growing in seeps on cliff walls and things like that. And in fact, they have adaptations for that because in Genlisea subgenus Tayloria, when the fruits are pollinated and produced, the pedicel actually curves down, and you can see that here. In some of the plants, the pollinated fruits have curved sharply downwards, and that's an adaptation to basically put the seeds right back onto the vertical surface on which they're growing. Another interesting little plant that's growing here, which has only been fairly recently described, is the lithophytic Genlisea nebulicola, which is extremely restricted in its range and only grows in the constant kind of spray and mist of particular waterfalls in southern Brazil, in the moss layer that grows on top of rocks, which is why it's quite small. And you can see a great photo there of it. In the spray, it's been left with a droplet of water around the leaf. Another interesting one here is Genlisea guyanensis, which grows in northern South America, and it's formed an almost aquatic habitat. You can see here it's got pretty much no photosynthetic leaves in the trap. In the rosette, it's all basically those trap leaves, the rhizophils, and it grows in this kind of floating mat of algae above a lake here. One particular interesting observation that's been brought to light in the past couple of months is Genlisea pallida. Now, this is in the group Recurvatae, and it produces these bright white flowers and these kind of loose rosettes of leaves, and that was photographed for the very first time pretty recently. So, moving on from Genlisea in the wild then, we have Genlisea in cultivation, which it will be of great interest to many carnivorous plant growers. Now, here is some Genlisea growing in my own personal collection. As you can see, I grow them potted in a substrate, and here you might be wondering what this is. This is a kind of granite-based gravel that I was trying out in order to suppress competing moss growth, but it did fail miserably. The moss didn't care; it grew through anyway. So I'll be discussing the kind of general aspects of cultivation, including potting and substrate, the water, ambient conditions, lighting, repotting, propagation, pests and diseases, and then a particular overview of specific plants. So in terms of substrate, I use a peat-based substrate for most of my plants in my Genlisea collection. Although peat is open to debate on the sustainability of it, particularly in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and in Europe as well. Less so in North America, and in other regions. But again, there are questions that can be raised about the sustainability of peat. So I am investigating alternatives, but I haven't found anything good yet. But as mentioned, it's got this kind of gravel top dressing, which, as you can see, the moss is just coming through. Anyway, now live sphagnum moss and rehydrated sphagnum moss is also perfectly workable as a substrate. As you can see here, this Genlisea violacea is growing happily in live sphagnum moss, although it's not where it's supposed to be. That's a weed in a Utricularia praetermissa pot. Now, for the peat, I tend to mix it with perlite at a ratio of about 70% peat, 30% perlite, just to help with kind of water flow through it, and so it doesn't get too compacted down and stodgy over time, which leads to anaerobic conditions. But with the live sphagnum, it's usually fairly airy and allows airflow to prevent becoming anaerobic. One innovative way that we see here of growing carnivorous plants was developed by Jeff Wong, a grower from the United States, and it was featured here in the June 1995 edition of the Carnivorous Plant newspaper. And it is where you grow the Genlisea in a tray of substrate above a grid or a piece of mesh, and allow the rhizophils to trail down into a water reservoir below. And we see a great example of this in the collection of Rita Carino, which is a great way of growing them, because it really allows you to examine the traps and the rhizophils without unpotting the plant or potentially damaging it. But you do need to make sure that this the water reservoir is covered, because the traps, if they are exposed to light, can begin photosynthesizing and producing leaves, which quickly becomes quite unseemly. Now, in terms of my general setup here, Genlisea enjoy very wet and humid conditions, so I have mine in closed propagators, as you can see here, although there are vents that can be opened to adjust humidity. In terms of light, Genlisea, they like light, but they don't like it too much. There is a fine balance, so I wouldn't call them shade-loving plants, but they do appreciate bright but indirect light. Subgenus Tayloria, so that's your species such as Flexuosa and Violacea and Lobata, Nebulicola, Exhibitionista, etc., prefer slightly lower levels of light. They're prone to getting a bit shy if you overlight them. But generally I would say that bright but indirect light is appropriate for them. These are LED lights. In terms of temperature, they don't like being too warm. This is very general because, as discussed, they come from a wide variety of different places. But I would say the optimum temperature for growing Genlisea is around 18 degrees Celsius, or something around there. If you get above 30 degrees Celsius, you will very quickly start encountering problems, particularly with the high altitude species such as Genlisea rorimensis and Genlisea aurea var aurea. Aurea var minor, is the fussy one. Aurea var aurea is relatively straightforward. But yes, generally I would say surprisingly cool growing, 18 degrees Celsius. In terms of water, I maintain the water level at about half the height of the pot, but you can certainly keep it much higher than that. I have the good fortune in Scotland of having tap water with a total dissolved solids, which is how mineralised it is. Genlisea are not a fan of minerals in water, as many carnivorous plants are not. But I have the good fortune of having tap water at around 20 parts per million, which is fine for watering them. I would say anything below 100 is okay. Below 50, great. So in most situations that will involve reverse osmosis water or distilled water. So yes, I would say the key is a good provision of water and humidity, and nice but not too bright light, and not keeping them too hot. Although there are a few species that enjoy warmer conditions, particularly the kind of lowland species such as Genlisea oxycentron and Genlisea filiformis. In terms of repotting, you can see here if they've been in pot for a while, it's quite easy to just slide them out. I repot once every 3 years or so. You can choose between round or square or another shape of pots. I do find that square is a more efficient use of space, but round pots allow the rhizophils to coil round themselves rather than being kind of bunched up at the corners. Now this is a demonstration of how I know it's time to repot, because my peat begins to leach tannins, which is a sign that it's probably breaking down, which increases the risk of situations becoming anaerobic and beginning to rot down there, which is a big no-no, because Genlisea are very prone to rot. They are, I would say, they're quite sensitive plants. They like consistency and they like very clean conditions. They don't like minerals, and they don't like any sort of anaerobic rotting or stale conditions. So, assuming you have got your Genlisea potted up in an appropriate substrate, you have it in nice light, clean water and good temperature, and it's growing well, you might decide, I'd like to have more of these fascinating and beautiful carnivorous plants that are so underappreciated in cultivation. How on earth can I get myself more? Now, the easiest way to do this, I would say, is to do vegetative propagation, which is where you take material from an existing plant and you sprout it. You remove it from the plant and it sprouts into new growth. Now, you can do that from either the traps or the photosynthetic leaves, as you can see here. Now, on the left, you can see there's already a photosynthetic leaf coming off this trap of Genlisea africana. And that is quite common for that species. It tends to spread itself around the pot, so it does it automatically for you. For other species, when unpotted, you can remove carefully a rhizophil and press it into, gently press it into wet substrate in a new pot or the same pot, and keep it well lit, and it should hopefully produce leaves and form a new plant rosette for you. You can do the same exact thing with the photosynthetic leaves. You can see this photo in the middle. When you keep them wet, you can just float them in water or put them on tissue paper as well. It doesn't have to be substrate for producing shoots off of the material that you remove. But they produce new rosettes, as you can see, all over the surface of the leaf. Usually the lower surface of the leaf, which is why this photo on the right is a good demonstration for propagation. You want to carefully remove a leaf, press it into the substrate, and it should produce rhizophils and photosynthetic leaves of a new plant within a couple of weeks. I would note that you want to be quite careful when you're doing this, because, as I mentioned, Genlisea are relatively sensitive plants, and if you bruise or damage the tissue, there's a high chance of damaging the cutting and introducing rot and failure. There's a relatively high level of failure anyway, but it's good enough. It works. I would also note that Genlisea roraimensis in particular is pretty much impossible in my experience to take vegetative cuttings from. You need to either wait for that to produce seeds, which we'll discuss next, or wait until the rosette grows enough that you can divide it into two with a clean scalpel or a knife. Another point on Genlisea roraimensis is that it is often missold or mislabeled in cultivation, and a lot of the Genlisea so-called roraimensis that you find are nigrocollis, particularly if they have the location Mount Roraima attached to them. Now, the other method, other than cuttings, is seed, because obviously Genlisea can be grown for their beautiful flowers, and as discussed with the different parts of the anatomy of them, it's relatively easy to produce seed if you have a steady hand and a good eye. Now, this is useful with a cocktail stick or something like that. Some species, such as Hispidula, will just produce seed pods on their own, but a lot of them need a helping hand to move the pollen from the anther to the stigma. So you would use a cocktail stick basically to scoop off this pollen and deposit it on the outer surface of the flap. And assuming it's successful, your plant will then start developing a seed pod, as we have discussed previously, before producing seeds. And you'll know they're ready because the seed pod just starts to crack, and then you can remove it and collect and harvest the seeds. Now, I would note that plants kept in very high humidity, above 90% or so, tend to have issues with pollen, and can even have issues with flower formation entirely. Very high humidity can lead to the tip rotting off of the flower stalk before the flowers open. So, assuming you've got your seeds, you can then sow them on a substrate such as wet peat, which is or sphagnum moss, similar to what you would have the adult plants in, or a pot of wet sand to, because the seedlings are very small, a pot of plain wet sand has less competition from algae and mould and mosses and things like that. This is a seedling from Genlisea roraimensis, because as I mentioned, they're impossible to do by vegetative propagation, but their saving grace is that they're very easy from seed. And this is, above it, a seedling from Genlisea africana. You can see producing its first kind of traps, and a new leaf coming out of its little baby rosette there. Now, once they're of an appropriate size, you can carefully transplant them, making sure not to break the rhizophils, and plant them up in another pot if you so desire. So, what pests and diseases affect Genlisea? Well, number one, we can see here, I don't actually have a photo of aphids on my Genlisea. I would like to say that's because I have fantastically clean Genlisea, which to some extent is true, but I have had issues with aphids before. You can get these little tiny, hard to spot aphids that come in, and they sit on the underside of your Genlisea leaves, and they cause deformed leaves and damage to the plants. And if they get serious enough, they can lead to the death of a plant, which is never good. Thankfully, Genlisea are fairly robust when it comes to treatment with pesticides, and they can deal with pretty much any common pesticide. What they can't deal with, however, I would note, is fungicides. Fungicides will severely impact Genlisea. They really do not like fungicides, which is interesting because aside from aphids, and also thrips sometimes, thrips can cause issues with Genlisea. But aside from insect or invertebrate pests, you also get a lot of issues with what's known as Genlisea sudden death syndrome, which is actually the same pathogen as the dreaded Browning heart disease that you find in Pinguicula, which is a group of three villainous pathogens known as Pythium, Phytophthora, and Fusarium. Two of those are water molds, and one is a filamentous fungus. Now, they enter the plant through damage to the rhizophils by, for example, somebody taking cuttings, which has happened to me before, unfortunately, or nematode or gnat damage if you have fungus gnats, the eternal enemy, in your soil, and it leads to very quick and rapid, what I would describe as melting of your Genlisea. And you can see this sort of vaguely slimy smear on the soil here is in the shape of where a leaf once was before it rotted away. There's not really any good solution to if you're having issues with Genlisea sudden death syndrome, and it has been noted in cultivation since 1893, so it's been a long-standing issue with growing these plants. But thankfully, in stable conditions, it's relatively rare, and it tends to only affect plants that have been recently transplanted. Now, you may be wondering, what's this intriguing yellow flower at the bottom? This is perhaps the most annoying pest among Genlisea, which is Utricularia, specifically Utricularia subulata. It's a small and very weedy Utricularia that tends to invade any pot that it can get its seed into, which it's quite good at doing. which is, it's all right. It produces quite nice flowers, but it's just, if you want to have a pure pot of Genlisea without any other species involved, it's annoying when you have a plant that is very hard to eradicate growing in there. So, and that brings us to the end of the presentation, which has run fantastically over time from what I estimated it would be. We have a range of different photos of plants here. We have flowers and traps and various different rosettes of interesting species here. So I would encourage you, there's approximately 30 species of Genlisea. And about half of those, or slightly more, are in cultivation. If you include location data and different clones, there's around 60 or so different strains of Genlisea, and I would encourage you to go catch them all. I think I've got around 54 in my collection at the moment, but they are available and they are out there. You just need to have a look for them. Carnivorous plant nurseries will generally carry some easy beginner species such as Hispidula or Flexuosa or the hybrid, and I would encourage anyone to give it a bash. You never know, because they are fascinating plants and they are very, very rewarding to grow. Now, without further ado, if you have any questions, do feel free to get in touch or leave them below. But thank you immensely for sticking around until the end of the video. I know it's been quite long.
The International Carnivorous Plant Society wants you to be successful with your plants. We welcome growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. We started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate these spectacular plants. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.